Alicent Hightower is one of the characters who was changed most dramatically when George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood was adapted into HBO's House of the Dragon. In the book, Alicent is considerably older than Rhaenyra, with the two women separated by roughly 9 years, whereas the show deliberately makes them close in age and childhood friends, creating a personal relationship that becomes the emotional foundation of their eventual conflict. Book Alicent is also portrayed as much more politically ambitious, calculating, and openly hostile toward Rhaenyra. She becomes a major force behind the Green faction and strongly supports her son Aegon's claim to the Iron Throne. The book does not give us the same detailed access to her emotions and inner conflict that the television series does. Fire and Blood is written as a fictional historical chronicle, so Alicent is largely presented through the accounts of historians rather than through her private thoughts. The show, on the other hand, turns her into a much more conflicted and sympathetic character. Her friendship with Rhaenyra, her difficult relationship with her father Otto, her marriage to Viserys, and her growing guilt over the consequences of the Green faction all become central to her story. Another major difference is her relationship with Ser Criston Cole. In Fire and Blood, there is no confirmed sexual relationship between Alicent and Criston. He is simply her sworn protector and an important Green supporter. The romantic and sexual relationship between them is an invention of the television series. The show also changes Alicent's role in several crucial political events. In the book, she is much more directly involved in the Green political machine and is portrayed as someone who actively fights to preserve her family's power. In the show, she increasingly finds herself trapped by decisions made by the men around her, particularly Otto, Aegon, Aemond, and Criston, and by the time the dance becomes a full-scale civil war, she is often horrified by what her own faction has unleashed. The difference becomes especially striking when Rhaenyra captures King's Landing. The book's Alicent remains firmly opposed to Rhaenyra, while the show develops their relationship in a completely different direction, with Alicent eventually meeting Rhaenyra secretly and offering a path toward surrender, even accepting that Aegon may have to die. That meeting is a major invention of the show and does not happen in Fire and Blood. But perhaps the biggest difference is what happens to Alicent after the Dance of the Dragons. Unlike Rhaenyra, Alicent survives the war. After Aegon II's death and the accession of Aegon III, Alicent is suspected of being involved in the poisoning of Aegon II. She is not executed, however. Instead, she is kept under guard and confined to her apartments in the Red Keep. Her life after the war becomes increasingly tragic. Isolated from the political world she once helped shape, Alicent spends much of her remaining time weeping, and her mental condition deteriorates. She becomes increasingly disturbed, eventually ripping apart her clothes and talking to herself, and one particularly striking detail from the book is that she comes to hate the color green, the very color that had symbolized the faction she once fought for. Then, in 133 AC, a terrible epidemic known as the Winter Fever reaches King's Landing. Alicent contracts the disease and eventually dies from it. Interestingly, during the final stages of the fever, when delirium affects many of those infected, Alicent briefly seems more lucid and confesses her sins to her septa. She speaks about wanting to see her children again and even talks about seeing King Jaehaerys, but notably does not speak of her husband Viserys. She ultimately dies during the winter fever epidemic, alone and imprisoned in the Red Keep, with her death regarded by some as a mercy after the suffering and mental decline she had endured. So, while the show presents Alicent as a tragic woman caught between her family, her former friendship with Rhaenyra and her growing realization that the war has destroyed everything around her, the book presents a colder and more politically aggressive Alicent whose ambitions help ignite the Dance of the Dragons, only for her to survive the war and spend her final days isolated, broken and haunted by everything that happened. Her ultimate fate is therefore one of the most ironic in Fire and Blood. Alicent fights for years to put her family on the Iron Throne, but when the war is finally over, she loses almost everything, is imprisoned by the very regime that follows the war, descends into despair, and finally dies from winter fever in 133 AC.